Thank you for joining us for the 7 Secrets of Effective Farmers webinar series, Risk Management. We are grateful to have Dr. Aaron Smith from University Tennessee Institute of Agriculture joining us as today's instructor. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please leave your microphones on mute and video off during the session. If you would like to locate the chat box, please type your name and location into the box to help me record attendance. And you can use it at any time during the session to submit a question. I am recording the session and plan to post it online in the event you would like to view it again or share with someone else. I will ask you to answer 2 questions at the end of the session to record your feedbacks. If there are no questions at this time, let's dive into today's session, risk management.
All right, well, thank you, Iris, for having me on. I'm gonna, as she mentioned, talk a little bit about risk management. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Aaron Smith. I'm in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics. I specialize primarily in crop economics, specifically crop marketing. So, I mean, I do end up covering multiple aspects. I do get very involved in policy as well. And so what I'm gonna talk about today is risk management, and it's something that's very important right now. You know, obviously with some of the things that have ended up occurring with COVID-19, it does reinforce the need for businesses and farmers to have a risk management plan, develop a comprehensive risk management plan to address all 5 major categories of agricultural risk. I'll step through what those risks are. It is important to kind of point out 2 different things. Some risks are known risks. And I'll use the example of price variability. So prices are always uncertain. We know that risk is going to occur. You know, we have tools that are available to try to mitigate some of that risk. Then we have another form of risk, sometimes referred to as a black swan event. Different people have different definitions of what a black swan event truly is. But essentially, it's unknown or unpredictable risk that can occur during a production year or in a business cycle. That, you know, kind of completely come out of nowhere to provide a substantial amount of uncertainty or unpredictability that you have to end up reacting to. So when we're talking about developing risk management plans, it's important to consider both of those types of risks, those that we're aware of but we choose to take on, and those that are more unpredictable. So the first thing I want to kind of open with, and this is kind of the theme I want people to kind of consider as they're looking at this presentation, and you just have to ask yourself, what are we trying to accomplish with risk management, right? And the simple answer to that is to prepare for multiple uncertain outcomes by reducing or mitigating the likelihood of an adverse outcome. And so again, we know that you can't predict what's going on in the future. Every business is different. But we do want to be aware of those factors that do add risk to both production, financially, you know, legal, human resources, a big one right now. But the bottom line is, even if we do have a comprehensive risk management plan, we cannot remove all of the risk in agriculture. It's something where without that risk, there wouldn't be a profit incentive, right? Because if we knew the certainty of an outcome, you know, there's not a premium for that can be ended up realized by the individual producer or business. So, you know, this quote from the risk management education centers, I think is really applicable. You know, risk is what makes it possible to make a profit. If there was no risk, there would be no return to the ability to successfully manage it. And that's really what we're talking about, is how do we successfully manage that risk? We're not getting rid of it. There's things that we can do to mitigate or offset it. I'll step through a few examples. The other one that I think is really important, this might be a little bit more broad than some people would prefer, but the challenge that we run into in risk management is that every business is different. Even if you are in the same industry, you'll have different resources, you'll have different skill sets. So again, you know, each business has individual risks. So identifying those risks is kind of the first step. And so when I'm going through this, I'm going to go through the 9 steps in risk management planning. I have highlighted some things that is probably more applicable or has really risen to the forefront during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not going to speak to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, but there is certain things that probably are much more at the forefront in terms of risk management in agriculture and those businesses that are supporting agriculture that probably 6 months ago or a year ago, we probably weren't considering. And now, again, this is something where we probably want to go back and revisit. So much has changed that we probably have to modify some of our assumptions, some of our risk mitigating strategies, some of the tools that we use in order to try to end up, managing the risk that we end up having. So the first thing, as I mentioned, I want to talk about is identifying those risks. And so we break it down. This is an excellent manual, the Introduction to Risk Management. It was put out by the Risk Management and Education Centers. There's 4 of those across the U.S. I have a link here to the full document. It's quite extensive, but this is one of the ones. I think it's a very well done document. It provides some additional details and context to some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today. But when we look at types of agriculture risk, we break it down into 5 main categories. We have production risk, marketing risk, financial, legal, and human. So when we step into this, I'll give you some examples of production risk, but it's essentially anything that's going to affect production activity, input, or process that can result in a range of outcomes. So, some key examples, this list could be much more extensive, obviously. A production risk is weather, climate changes, pests, diseases, technological obsolescence. So that's, having infrastructure that is no longer being able to accomplish those goals. And then one that I think is really important right now, obviously, that COVID-19 has highlighted is loss of labor supply. When you think back to when this first started hitting, that did become a major issue where can you get even if you've grown a successful crop, can you get the labor to harvest it? Can you get the labor to plant it, to get it in the ground? So again, looking at how some of this production risk, and you will see some overlap between categories because you could put that in human risk as well. And so when we look at these, first you want to identify that risk and then think in the back of your mind, how can we mitigate some of these risks? So when we look at pests and diseases, obviously that is some type of either chemical or other biological control to end up mitigating those. We think of weather, mitigation risk for droughts is obviously irrigation. So again, when we're thinking about these, how do we, first identify it, and then what are some potentials that we can use to mitigate that risk on our individual operations? Marketing risk. Market related activity or event that leads to the variability of input out prices. Obviously, we have cyclical prices for a lot of our agriculture goods. That's something that is more easily to mitigate than, say, the logistical disruptions that were created by COVID-19. Market access is another one, and then government action. In my time with UT, I've never seen so many government programs in such a condensed window. And so when you're thinking about it from a marketing standpoint, understanding what programs are available, how you can use them, how they can benefit your business is one of these risk mitigating tools that are kind of on an ad hoc basis. So we have to evaluate those in real time. Can they end up helping our individual operations? And, understanding what that market is. When you look at, this is a picture from a grocery store, obviously back a few months ago when this first started happening, we seen a tremendous amount of uncertainty or availability issues in grocery stores. And the thing that I'll kind of use to illustrate this is it's not like we ran out of beef, right? We just completely changed the way that we move products. And it took a little while for the logistical system or the supply chain to end up adjusting to that. And now we're back to another place, right? And so we're considering this. There's the immediate and the future, right? So when I'll use meat as an example. Right now, we're in a reasonably good place, but in 6 months, are we going to end up seeing additional closures of businesses? Are we going to end up seeing some of that grocery store purchases get moved back to restaurants? It's a very fluid situation. And so again, there's not necessarily going to be a solution to everything, but identifying those risks, I think, is very important on an individual basis. Financial risk, factors that threaten the financial health of the business. So cost and availability of capital. Obviously, lending is a big thing. One of the, minor positives of the current downturn is that capital is reasonably cheap, both through banks and through, government programs. So that's something where there is the potential to end up getting some additional cash flow or some additional resources. the ability to maintain and grow equity, and then the ability to absorb short-term or long-term financial shocks. Obviously, there are many businesses right now that are really getting hit hard by this. There's some that have benefited, you know, getting additional business during a challenging time that we've been in recently. Then legal risk, obviously, you know, that's a big topic for a lot of businesses, and that can focus around, you know, repayment terms of credit. Pesticide application is one that affects multiple industries. Marketing contracts, if you've been involved in hemp, you know, that's a massive risk for a lot of people. Employee rules and regulations, those are very dynamic under the current circumstances. How do you keep your employees safe and protected given you know, some of the close proximity of our businesses or field level labor? And then looking at inheritance law, you know, you have different categories of risk that we can get into. Organizational structure is one that I think is really important, and then also looking at those public policies and changes in attitudes, right? There can be different things. If you see regulations come out from the federal government, FDA, those types of things, they have a tremendous amount of risk that can end up really changing how you operate different businesses. Then the last category of risk is human risk. So when we look at human risk, it's the ability to keep all your employees safe and yourself safe in the workplace, satisfied and productive. You know, human health and well-being is a real key one right now, making sure that employees are safe. But it also involves family and business relationships, employee management, and transition planning. You know, having some goals in terms of what you would like to accomplish through the business, I think is very important to end up getting down on paper and say, okay, well, you know what, if me as the financial guru for the business, if something happens to me, I have a heart attack or a stroke, who's next up? Who is the one that is going to end up coming in and being able to meet with the banker, meet with the lawyer, you know, make those types of decisions? So identifying, you know, key positions, having some type of, you know, backup plan, or, you know, a next up mentality to do some cross training so that there isn't a huge void in what the business is able to accomplish if you do lose a key person. The second step in the risk management planning process is measuring risk. This one, it gets tricky, and it really highlights the importance of good records. What we know is that there's a wide range or probability of outcomes, right? We don't know when we enter a growing season, for example, what that outcome is going to be. I'll use corn as an example. You know, we have a target yield, we'll say 175 bushels per acre is what we're hoping to get. Are we going to get that? No, sometimes we're going to get 195, sometimes we're going to get 150, right? And so, you know, what we want to do is kind of look at, well, can we measure what that variability is? And the answer is usually if you have good records, you can look at something like yield variability over a 10-year period. Be like, well, okay, here's kind of my best case scenario, or high or low. This is my most likely outcome. One thing that I always caution people when they're doing this type of measuring risk is to understand their distribution. And so what I mean by that is quite often, you know, you'll see a normal distribution where there's a 50% chance of something higher than the average, a 50% chance of something lower happening. That's typically not the case. Typically, you will get a skewed distribution, right? And so you may have a much bigger probability of having something higher or lower, depending on what you're measuring. And so again, when we're looking at this, again, getting back to what the purpose of risk management is, what we're trying to do is eliminate that real bad adverse outcome from happening. So again, you're not removing all risk. I'll use crop insurance as an example. So if you have a profit level, there's a whole range of different profit levels that could end up occurring. If you purchase crop insurance, for example, what you're trying to do is maybe stop any losses of over $250 an acre. It's going to depend on how you buy up crop insurance, what products you're using. But again, that's what we're trying to end up looking at. And you really do need to have the data and the record keeping ability to measure that correctly. The other one is assess risk-bearing capacity. And again, everybody has different levels of risk tolerance. Some people actually really enjoy, you know, the challenge or I guess I don't want to say thrill, but, you know, enjoy taking on risk. They look at it as a challenge, and it's something that they really need to motivate themselves. And so again, I mean, there's different levels of risk-bearing capacity that you want to end up looking at. When we look at the ability to withstand a negative outcome, again, that's dependent on what the individual business's position is, both from a liquidity and solvency standpoint, and then cash flow obligations. And so when we look at this, getting back to kind of the COVID circumstances right now is if you're looking out as to what's going on, how long are we going to be in these current circumstances, and what's the potential magnitude of the outcomes and the changes? So again, if you have a large portion of cash inflow or outflow, you may end up having a lower risk tolerance. And again, it highlights the importance of records and data. I mentioned this, risk averse is somebody that really doesn't want to do anything or doesn't want to take on any risky ventures. Risk preferring are those that really enjoy. One thing that we've probably done a little bit too much on the economic side of things is focused on the negative effects of COVID-19, and there is a lot of them out there. But there are some real opportunities for those that are willing to take on risk, right? There's not any certainty, but there is going to be some substantial potential changes in the way that we deliver food from farm to the consumer. And those that are willing to take on the risk and do the legwork to try to figure out how these changes might be able to capitalize on from a financial standpoint do have the potential to really benefit or get involved in how we redefine this system. So the fifth one is establish risk management goals. You know, one thing that is really important is to make sure those goals are specific, that you can measure them, that they're attainable. You want it to be challenging, but realistic and time specific, right? So, you know, if you're looking at an annual goal, you know, if you put out there, well, I want to end up increasing my net worth from 0 to 500,000 in a 1 year period. Well, that might not be realistic, and the time might be a little bit off to end up doing that. I do encourage people to write stuff down. It is, and I think Iris has talked about this in the past, when you write some of these things down, it doesn't have to be an extensive document, but just getting it down so that, you know, you can revisit it, take a look at it, and, you know, modify it as you see fit, I think is really important. If you have some of these ideas just going around through your head and you don't get them down, you can sometimes lose sight of what you're really trying to accomplish. And the other one, I mean, goals should focus on factors, decisions that one has the most control over. So, you know, I'll go back to kind of the row crop side of things, but this applies to several other industries. Internal and external factors. How much control does a soybean farmer have over trade negotiations with China? Well, the answer is none, right? I mean, that's something that obviously it's a massive risk. It's going to affect the prices. It's going to affect movement of product. But we don't have control over that. What we do have control over is using something like a futures contract or an options contract to mitigate the extreme price loss, right? So again, we can be aware of a lot of these risks, but we really have to focus on, can we mitigate that? And when we focus on stuff that's within our control, that's really what we want to do. We do want to be cognizant of the external forces, but focus on what's within our control and how we can mitigate that. The other thing too that is important is to make sure that these goals reflect the values, interests, and resources and capabilities of the business. You can have aspirational goals, or you can have ones that you're working with for the current production year. So again, laying those out with the you know, consideration for the amount of resources and the capabilities of the business, both from a human standpoint and a financial standpoint, is really important. Provide a basis for all business and family decisions. So again, when you write down some goals, again, they don't have to be extensive, but you should end up revisiting them if it is making a decision. Say you're looking to expand. Is this really what you want to do from both a business standpoint and from your individual family standpoint? And set priorities. You know, everybody has limited resources. Some are more plentiful than others. But, you know, if you have a list of, okay, maybe I need that tractor, or I could go out and get, you know, some additional land, or, you know, what are your priorities in terms of expanding your business and allocating those resources, and then trying to measure that progress, right, is really key. So we're going to look at risk management tools. There is a massive amount of risk management tools that are out there for each one of these categories. You have to identify the tools that are available to mitigate each type of risk. And then you have to end up having an understanding of these tools. I know I run into this on the crop marketing side of things. Futures and options are a great tool for producers to use to mitigate price risk, but there's a substantial number of producers that aren't familiar or aren't comfortable using those tools. And again, it's something where the tool's out there, but you're not comfortable using it. There's probably other alternatives that are better for that individual producer. So looking at things like, cash forward contracts or minimum price contracts might be a better option. It may not be the one that I would select or the neighbor might select, but it's something that they're more comfortable with and willing to end up doing. And so looking at those that reduce risk production, obviously investing in irrigation or chemical control. And then some of the other risk management tools will offset that risk to a third party, right? So these, like herbicides and irrigation, will reduce the risk, whereas crop insurance and marketing contracts offset it onto a third party, and you pay a premium for that. For crop insurance, your crop insurance premium. For the contract, it's usually foregoing some of the upside. There may even be some fees that are affiliated with that tool. I think this is one of the most important ones when you're developing a risk management strategy, is seek out professional assistance. Given the complexity of agriculture and how many different factors affect profitability of a business, you really do need to have a good support network around you. Having a lender, an insurance agent, extension employees are a great source of information. They've seen it from multiple producers within their region. They've got a very concentrated set of knowledge that's specific to an individual county that you're not going to get from somebody that's maybe at the state level that is looking at it from a much wider scope, right? You can get some much more applicable information by leaning on those people. Lawyers, accountants, and consultants are also very valuable resources. And other producers. I mean, I think there's a tremendous value to having a group of producers, whether it's a formal, informal mentorship arrangement, to end up, saying, well, okay, this is a producer that I really respect. I would love to bounce some ideas off of him, and to make sure that I solicit his opinion if I'm going to make a major decision. Working in those types of contexts, I think, is tremendously valuable. The one that is also really important when you're doing these risk management plans is you have to make a decision and implement the plan. You can do all the planning in the world, you can quantify everything, but eventually you have to get to a point where you're actually going to make a decision and implement it. And that is really important. So if you construct that written plan, you really have to set a timeline and determine how you're going to track progress and measure outcomes. One thing that I see a lot of people kind of get tripped up on when they're doing a risk management plan is they try to make it all encompassing. They make this massive document that is very challenging to implement. I always say start small. Take one category of risk or one thing that you identify as a real key risk to your operation, and start with that. I do the same thing with marketing plans. Start with half a page and we'll get it down in writing, and then you can revisit that on a monthly or quarterly or an annual basis and continue to build that plan out. If you try to start with a comprehensive risk management plan, a lot of times you'll drive yourself crazy. Evaluating the results. So again, when you end up implementing something, you want to be able to quantify how that has occurred. Did you get the result that you thought you would? It doesn't necessarily mean that risk management strategy was wrong. It's just that maybe there was something else that we ended up missing, or maybe there was some other factor that overrode that risk management action that you were trying to end up doing. It's really important to compare that, right? What was the actual result? What was the anticipated result? So that you can make adjustments for future decision cycles. And so, when you look at right now where we're at, a lot of risk management plans, we're in a completely different set of circumstances. So looking at, well, what do we need to do for the upcoming next 6 months or the next year? Now, one challenge that there is right now, and there's not a silver bullet to this, is that it's so uncertain. We can't predict how, coronavirus is going to continue to end up moving through the economy. We could see, infections go down. We could see infections go up. We could see them stay roughly the same, right? So again, there's a wide range of outcomes But you know, looking at what we've done over the last 6 months, what are we going to do over the next 6 months to a year? So managing production risk. This is just a few kind of observations about production risk. Growers have 3 choices in dealing successfully with production risk: control or minimize the risk. I mentioned irrigation to minimize the impact of drought. That's controlling or minimizing the risk. Reduce variability. So from a financial standpoint, if you diversify, if you have multiple enterprises, your ability to withstand a shock in one commodity market can be improved if you're involved in multiple commodity markets. Again, this is very business specific. You have to look at what the capital is that you've got tied up in things like machinery to see if this makes sense. But it is a way to end up mitigating a shock on one commodity. If you're 100% in cattle, you know, that's something where if the cattle markets turn against you, your risk is substantial. You can transfer risk. I mentioned that. You can use crop insurance, pay that premium, and move some of the yield and revenue risk off for that premium. When we look at production risk management checklists, these are some of the questions that should be asked. You know, what are your major sources of crop and livestock production risk? As I mentioned, everybody's going to be a little bit different. You know, are the knowledge and management abilities available to diversify or add another enterprise? You know, we've seen a lot of that in hemp, where, you know, did we have the skill set that was going to make us successful? In some cases, the answer was yes. In some cases, I would say that they probably were not set up to be successful from the beginning. Is there a strong level of commitment to diversify? Some people are in agriculture for very different reasons. If you are in it because you want to have a cow-calf herd and you're not maybe as focused on profitability, you know, diversification is probably not something that is going to be of interest. What are the income and risk relationships between a prospective new enterprise and existing enterprises? Again, this goes back to kind of, there are going to be some substantial opportunities in agriculture through this COVID-19 pandemic. One, that there's a tremendous amount of interest right now, and there's some feasibility studies out there, is, you know, opening a meat processing facility. And so I've spoken with people at TDA, and they're getting, you know, pretty much weekly calls on, should I end up doing this? Is this something that I can end up adding to my operation that I can benefit from long term? And the answer is potentially, right? You really have to weigh what you're looking at doing, what the costs are, and how that's going to end up potentially benefiting your existing operation. Will the new enterprise provide effective diversification? If you go from corn to soybeans, I would argue that you are not diversified. Those two markets are highly correlated. They'll move in the same direction most of the time, not all the time. So you do have to be aware of how those interrelations between commodities. Are you truly diversified, or are you just adding a very similar commodity? What are the implications of a crop loss on the ability to meet debt obligations and cash flow needs? So, you know, there's substantial amount of challenges that are out there, getting particularly into specialty crops. If you start growing something, you do have a disease outbreak, you can, you know, have catastrophic losses that can adversely affect other enterprises within the business. I am a firm believer in crop insurance and other insurance products to offset some of that risk or lay it on somebody else. I think it is very well worth it to meet with your crop insurance agent and really work the numbers to make sure that you're getting the most out of the product. How does that work with your marketing plan? I think that's really important on the row crop side of things, and also on the vegetable side of things as well. Are there no cost or low cost practices that can be implemented? You know, there's a whole range of costs for mitigating some of these risks. Obviously, seeking out some that are lower cost probably doesn't mitigate as much of the risk. The higher cost ones probably, hopefully, mitigate more of the risk. So looking at the different cost structures, I think, is important. You know, the legal conditions and implications of contracting. I don't want to continue to beat on hemp, but you know, there were some real issues there, right? Were you really mitigating any risk by entering some of those production contracts? And the answer is likely probably not. The quality of the contract was probably not where it needed to be. And then adopting new technologies can also help mitigate some of that risk. When we look at marketing risk, I'm a huge proponent of writing down a marketing plan, set specific actions, time periods. We all have production cycles when we know that we're going to have marketable product coming out. Just writing it down doesn't necessarily mean that you have to pull the trigger. For example, if you're looking at, okay, I want to pre-price 50% of my soybean crop. If you're at May and prices are severely depressed, maybe you kick that can down the road. You know, it's something where if you have it down on paper, you need to have the ability to be flexible as well, and understand the alternatives and tools the business wishes to use. One of the ones that is very important on the crop side of things is storage. Storage is a fantastic marketing tool. It's one that gives you a much longer, more defined marketing term, and you remove a lot of the production risks. So looking at those types of things, obviously perishables, you don't have the option to do that. So you're probably much more regimented in when your sales have to end up occurring. But again, that needs to be factored in when you're evaluating your marketing risk. One of the big ones that I see is the discipline to follow through. And so again, when you say a corn producer says, well, I'm going to sell 10,000 bushels when it hits 425. It hits 425, and what's the first thing they say? Well, it's going to go to 450, right? And then what happens? It reverses course, and all of a sudden you're selling at 385. And so if you know that you're making money at 425 and you hit that, you know, you have to have the discipline to follow through. Otherwise, the plan is not effective if you're not willing to act upon it. Components of marketing decisions, again, when to price or sell, where to price or sell. Location is a big thing right now. Obviously, the way, particularly for vegetables, the way that people are buying has changed. I was on a conference call with TDA, and they were saying that, you know, things like CSAs were up, you know, about 400%. They don't have great statistics on it, but, you know, where you're selling these products is changing substantially because of our current circumstances. What form, grade, or quality are you going to sell? There's a huge difference in quality, and that can end up having direct price implications. So again, you know, you have to kind of understand if you're targeting a specific quality and all of a sudden it's lower quality for whatever reason, you know, what's your next alternative for moving that product? How to price, there's several ways you can do it. We mentioned contracting, futures and options for some commodities. What services do you use? Some people are much more willing to get involved in the marketing process. Others are, you know what, I'm going to pay that professional. He's going to look after when he's going to pull the trigger. I'm going to give him the parameters that I'm looking for, and I'm going to offset that off to somebody else. And you know, that's perfectly fine. That's quite in several circumstances, that might be the best alternative, just because then you're designating a professional. Now, obviously, we want to be cognizant of the people that we are using. We need to surround ourselves with high quality people that you trust and build a relationship. I think one of the big things that we see in terms of professionals is that relationship is so important. Once you've established that relationship, you know, the likelihood of somebody jumping to a low cost alternative, I think really is diminished if you're able to build that relationship with other people. So when you're looking at marketing, is the marketing plan feasible, and does it fit the producer's risk preferences? So again, when you're looking at something like fruits and vegetables, you know, maybe you were selling to restaurants, but that's not a viable option anymore. You know, can you end up transitioning to a CSA? Those aren't the easiest things to end up doing. So is it feasible? And is it within your risk preference to end up incurring the financial needs or other inputs required in order to pull that off? Is the marketing plan coordinated with the financial plan to ensure farm income meets cash flow needs? Again, that's really important. I think budgeting is an incredibly valuable tool, and particularly benchmarking against yourself over time. It'll really give you an indication of what your resources coming in are versus what your outlays are. There's always going to be anomalies, but again, having an understanding of how your income and your expenses match up, both from an overall standpoint, but also seasonal, I think is incredibly important. It feeds into multiple aspects of obtaining credit and other decision-making components. Is the marketing plan coordinated with crop insurance? You know, when you're looking at your traditional row crops, I think that's just that's the very minimum starting point in terms of developing a marketing plan, is to evaluate what you're covering in terms of your crop insurance and making sure you're not double protecting crop by having excess premiums relative to what you've entered into in marketing contracts. And then also looking at what that historical data is. How much variability is there? There's going to be some that are going to have a much smaller level of variability in their production. Others are going to be much wider. Does the producer's lender understand the marketing plan? One that I've seen, unfortunately, is if somebody is using futures and options, they have a margin account, the financial resources can be extensive. If the lender isn't aware of the strategy that they're trying to execute, and all of a sudden they get a margin call, it can really put you in a bind financially if you don't have the resources to cover that. It can really amplify a marketing loss really quick. What are the cost returns and associated risk alternative strategies? Again, if you look at something such as storage, right? You can look at, yeah, you've removed a bunch of production risk, but you do have to end up monitoring those bins, making sure that you don't get mold or something else in there. And so again, it's just different risks based on what you're looking at doing. Where can producers get professional help that they are most comfortable with and will provide assistance that is consistent with the situation, goals, and risk management philosophy? One of the ones that's really challenging right now is to kind of understand what's going on with some of these government programs. It can be incredibly difficult. These programs are something that they've developed on an ad hoc basis. And so some of them are simple, but there is a tremendous amount of detail that's out there. Whether you're eligible for them depends on how you ended up marketing that crop, the time intervals that you ended up marketing that crop. So, being aware of that is incredibly important, and relying on people that maybe know more about that program is probably the better way, because you can get really bogged down in some of the technical jargon that is available in there. And then, upgrading those skills. If that's something you want to focus on, going to a webinar on how to use futures and options. If it's something where you'd rather offset it and just give the duties to somebody else, whether it's a professional or an employee, that's perfectly fine as well. But making sure that whoever's making that decision is up to date. Financial risk, obviously, Iris can probably speak more to this, but the importance of financial statements, making sure that they're properly prepared, making sure that your records to generate them are great, or as good as they can end up being. One of the things that we always say is, if you put garbage in, you get garbage out. So what you really want to do is make sure that you've got high quality statements. You can generate it so you can really bear down into some of these financial performance measures. Liquidity, solvency, profitability, and repayment capacity are some of the key ones that we always look at. What we're trying to look at is, okay, what are the risks, for each individual operation, and looking at, the cost of capital. Everybody has different borrowing needs. Everybody has different borrowing abilities, but making sure that you can, meet those cash flow needs in a timely manner. And then again, ability to absorb short-term financial shock. So when you are speaking with lenders, you always want to make sure that there is a reasonable buffer in there, or a contingency if we do end up seeing something that is adverse in the short, or in the short term or long term. So we look at it, are your financial records in place? It's so important to end up having those. What have been the financial trends of the business? Different businesses go through growth points. If you look at things like craft breweries, craft distilleries, we've seen tremendous growth in those industries over the last 5 or 10 years. This year and potentially into 2021 are going to be very challenging for those industries. So, understanding what the trend is within that individual business is very important. Benchmarking, I think, is an incredibly valuable tool. It's easy to benchmark against yourself, but if you can benchmark against your peers, it is even better. It's not always available. Data can be limited availability. But looking at what some of those key financial ratios are compared to others in your industry, I think is a great thing to end up doing. And then maintaining those lenders, or those relationships with those professionals such as lenders. When you look at lower interest rates, hey, maybe if you have a great relationship with your lender, maybe you can take some of that high interest debt and try to move it into a lower interest product during these time periods. When we look at cash flow, we always want to look at operating inputs, machinery, personnel, land costs, debt payments, taxes. Cost of living is a big one, and then farm overhead. Looking at those individual categories to make sure that we understand how much is going out the front door in terms of expenses, what's coming in terms of the revenue side. How can we protect those profit margins? Again, marketing plays a key role in that, as does production. Have what-if scenarios. And again, I don't think there was a lot of people that seen the pandemic coming. It wasn't completely out of the realm of possibilities. But having some, okay, well, what if this occurs? How would we react to that? And you're never going to be able to cover everything. But if you have some, concerns over this happening, this would be devastating to the business, can you mitigate that risk in some capacity? Legal risk, this is one where, again, you really want to get professional advice on this. Having a great lawyer to make sure that he reviews your contractual arrangements, making sure that your business organization is appropriate, both from a liability standpoint, a tax standpoint, and increasingly a government payment standpoint. It's something where, with the rise of these government payments through the CARES Act, it is something where, based on your legal entity, you may be able to get more government payments or assistance if you do have a different legal structure. Now, again, I'm not advocating for doing it just solely on that basis, but it is a consideration that I've spoken with producers about is the legal structure prohibiting me from participating to the fullest in these programs while understanding, some of these other issues. Liability is going to be another one, and then public policy and attitudes is another one that's really important from a legal standpoint. So one of the big ones is, do you have the proper liability insurance? Obviously with having the issues that we've got, there's going to be some potential changes to what businesses are going to be able to do in terms of insuring against getting sued. So that's something that's going to be very dynamic over the next few months, maybe the next couple of years. Have all new acquisitions been added to the insurance coverage? So if you've added machinery, if you've added property, make sure that they've added to your insurance policy. Are contracts in place? Again, it depends on the quality of the contract. Is care taken to ensure that all parties have sufficient knowledge to make informed decisions? That's one that I think communication really helps. Make sure that you understand what is getting into. Our farm activities in compliance with local, state, and federal laws and regulations. There's been a ton of changes in those. So again, having somebody that can end up providing you the information on an ongoing basis to make sure that you're aware of what's going on and any of the changes that affect your business is important. And do they stay current on those? Do owners or managers stay current on trends in consumer attitudes and preferences? Again, you'll see some overlap with that in, say, marketing, right? If you're seeing a whole bunch of changes in consumer attitudes and how they're making their purchases, you have to be able to adapt to those. Managing human risk, again, making sure that we keep people that are strong performers in our businesses, I think is really important, but also keeping with health and safety. A lot of the issues that we've seen is making sure that we can physically distance, wear masks when we can't, wash hands, make sure that we disinfect. That has all changed. We do want to make sure that the work assignments and schedules are consistent with the skill and physical limitations of individuals. All safety precautions should have a degree of training, what's expected of each employee, and then making sure that we have proper maintenance to ensure that individual employees are protected, and then follow instructions when using things like chemicals. And use protective equipment when necessary. Purchasing health, life, and disability insurance policies for the owner and the operator, and potentially in addition to some of the employees. So we're managing human risk. We really do need to consider this providing training for backup or support within the farm business to make sure that, if something does happen to a key individual, that there is coverage there to fill in any gaps so we don't see a tremendous disruption in production. Prime example of this is if you're a sole proprietor, you're the only person on the operation, and you are growing pumpkins, for example. If you break your leg and all of a sudden you can't go out and do the harvest, is there a backup plan as to who can come out and assist you in terms of making sure that task is accomplished? It's somewhere that depending on the industry, it can be very time specific. Make sure that you can communicate with your employees if you have multiple employees. And, one of the ones that is always challenging is working with families. So making sure that there's some rules and some guides so that things don't fester under the surface. And then seek out, legal counsel regarding financial and tax implications if people, either pass away or exit the business. Succession planning is obviously a very big component of this, making sure that you know how you're going to transition, what the tax implications are, who's going to be involved. If you have siblings that are off the farm, making sure that they don't feel like they're left out in the process. You know, equitable is not always equal. And so if you have somebody that's working on a farm, you know, if it's agreed upon that, hey, they put in a decade of work on the farm, whereas somebody else went out and pursued a different career, that doesn't necessarily translate into the first sibling getting everything, but should it be 50-50? Probably not at that juncture. So when we look at this, you know, the backup and the training, you know, how-to manuals, that's something where, depending on the size of the operation, there's probably information out there that you can end up using in terms of training people that is publicly available. Is farm safety included in training opportunities? You know, that's something that I think is really important to make sure that people are aware of how to end up operating a piece of machinery in particular. You don't want anybody getting hurt on site. And then, you know, have you ended up having a safety or health plan been prepared and shared with family members, business partners, and employees? Look at communication forms, conflict resolution. You're obviously going to have employees that from time to time won't get along. How are you going to end up managing that? What are the protocols that are outlaid on that? You know, has a transition plan been prepared? One thing that we've seen some recent changes in is when you're looking at transition planning, if there is not a child that is coming back to work on the farm, is there the opportunity to bring a very valuable employee into that farming operation as a way to transition that and also keep that employee engaged and happy with his individual job? So just to kind of summarize, you know, I always think it's incredibly important to start small and build the plan over time. Go through each one of those risk categories. You know, you're probably not going to want to focus on everything at once, but identify one or two things that you think is really important to consider, or at least try to partially mitigate, and start with those ones. Develop a plan. Like I said, start very simple, you know, just one or two pages, and then build upon that and continually revisit to try to improve it on an annual basis. And make sure that you're implementing. If you're putting it down on paper and you're not implementing it, you're not getting much benefit from it. And then make sure that you're able to quantify the results. I think benchmarking from a financial standpoint is an incredibly important and valuable tool that allows you to look at, well, this is what I expected, this is what ended up happening historically, and this is what happened in this year. And then always trying to improve that plan over time. The one thing that I will kind of end up saying is that, you know, if you are going to end up measuring the results, you do have to have the data and records. And, you know, obviously on the economic side of things, we lean more towards financial records, but production records, you know, human resource records, they are essential as well. You really have to have an understanding of what's going on under each one of those categories to make sure that you can quantify it in some meaningful ways so that you can potentially improve the result next time. And I'll kind of end with a quote from Dr. Clark Garland. You cannot manage what you cannot measure. So coming up with some measurable component, I think is really important so that you can end up making sure that you are getting the most out of your plan, and you can end up modifying it in the future. So with that, Iris, I will stop sharing. I appreciate everybody's time and attention. And if there are any questions, I will answer them now.
Thank you, Aaron. This is a lot of great information. I don't know about you all, but I'm going to print it out and put it in my folder. And totally agree with you that it's strange time right now, but it's also opportunity, you know, a lot of problems being exposed, and just tackle them, evaluate your farm business in these risk categories. And I would definitely print it out and just sit down with my employee and see. We got a question. Is a disaster plan under risk management plan, or should I separate it?
You definitely would want to consider that in your risk management plan. I guess it depends on the disaster, right? I mean, if you're looking at it, you know, it could be addressed in multiple ways. The first one, I'll kind of go back to production. You know, if you are considering your production risk and say you get a flood, you know, that's a production risk. It can also be classified as a disaster, right? And so there should be something in there. You know, if you know that you have low-lying land, for example, you know, you probably want to focus on that and have a flood plan or, you know, crop insurance or those types of products that is mitigating that specific disaster. You know, I would assume that it could be a component of the risk management plan. You'd have to really identify what that disaster that you're looking at. And if it is something where it's much more prevalent for your industry, I will use animal health as an example, right? And so there's tremendous, and that would fall under your production risk. So that would be part of your risk management plan. But you may want to develop a disaster plan if you had, say, a biosecurity issue where you had to euthanize animals or something along those lines. That could be a subcomponent of a larger plan. Depending on the disaster, I think you'd want to do a much more, a much deeper dive on that than, say, just a general risk management plan if it's something that is really important to the business that you're running.
Thank you, Aaron. Do we have any other questions? Okay, if we don't have any questions for Aaron, that I will ask you to answer these 2 questions that shown on your screen. It helps us to record your feedbacks.
Iris, it's not up.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Larry. All right, here we go. All right, thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you, Aaron, again. We hope everyone to join us next month when we learn about labor management, and this is going to be a new topic for this year and really important topic as well.
Thanks, Iris.
Thanks.